Adab, welcome to Islam After Colonialism, a series co-sponsored by the University of Exeter Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies. And I'm Nauman Naqvi from the Department of Comparative Humanities at Habib University. Allow me to begin with a brief description of the rationale of this series, which is now in its third term. But for those of you who might be new to the series and this lecture, allow me to begin with a brief description. Across the world, modern colonial rule has not only devastated the economies and ecologies of non-Western societies, it has dramatically transformed their cultures and traditions in innumerable ways. From the replacement of metaphysics and spirituality by historical and political religions, to the emergence of divisive nationalism and nation states, the contemporary world cannot be understood without the profound impact of modern white supremacist colonial rule based on modern ideas of racial and cultural segregation, historical superiority, and the civilizing mission and national competition for global power and progress. Habib University's Department of Comparative Humanities and the University of Exeter's Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies have launched this fortnightly web series to explore not only the radical transformation of regional Islam during the period of modern apartheid colonial rule, as well as in the post-colonial period, but also the living potentials of the pre-colonial past, as well as the urgent decolonial question of what is possible today, what can we do, and how can we live now. And with that brief description, I'll turn to my colleague, Dr. Sajjad Rizvi from the University of Exeter to introduce our very, very distinguished speaker today.
Thank you, Nauman. And yes, it is a pleasure to introduce Professor Margrit Pernua, who is a senior researcher at the Center for the History of Emotions at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin, as well as an extraordinary professor at the Freie Universität Berlin. She's quite well known for her work on colonial and post-colonial South Asia, and from the perspective of the history of emotions, and also from the perspective of conceptual history. Very much the application of Reinhard Koselleck's method on this sort of material is what's really kind of interesting and unique. Her most recent book is Emotions and Modernity in Colonial India, which came out just before the lockdown in 2019 with OUP New Delhi. And I know that more recently she has been extending her work on the idea of temporalities and notions of temporality, which I think will come up today. And so in today's presentation, she will be extending that inquiry into temporalities and linking it in with her earlier work. She started off working on Hyderabad, on the late state before Indian independence. And the title of her presentation today is Longing for the Past, Bahadur Yar Jung and the Masculinity of Islamic History. So without any further delay from us, please, Margrit, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for having me for this conversation. I was a bit hesitant in the beginning whether the topic really fitted the question of decoloniality and decolonization, but then when I reread what I wanted to say, I think it really is one of the core topics you made me realize. So thanks a lot for that. If we think about temporalities today, the model that we are usually following is a very neatly separated temporality. So the past, the present, and the future are three categories which do not overlap. They are separate, and one follows the other in a unidirectional way. The future is unknown, and the past can only be accessed through historiography. So it is from the present, the subjects who are living in the present who have to make an effort to access the past, and this access to the past, which can proceed only from the present, is done through history writing. This means that any agency to link the past, the present, and the future can only be through humans living in the present. This means, or let me start another way, let me start the other way around. This model is not the only model we have known through history. And what I would like to do today is to inquire in some of the other models which have been there in South Asia as recent as the first half of the 20th century, and to look how they have been excluded and how other temporalities have been marginalized through colonialism, and whether there is a possibility that they might help us think about our own way to relate to the past and to the future, which need not be the model of enlightenment in the West. I will be looking at how the gaze back to the time of the Prophet has been transformed from the 19th to the 20th century. As you all know, of course, the time of the Prophet is endowed with a moral component. It is the time to which Muslims refer back as the best time which has happened to the world. At the same time, there is only a very limited number of sources. So the sources are finite, and historians know all the sources that are there to explore the history of the age of the Prophet. It is the past, but this past is present in the present. So it is not a past which is gone once and for all, which would be the classic Enlightenment concept. So once the past is gone, it is gone. The past of the Prophet is both historical and also still present within our present at the moment and within each present. And it is not only present in the present, but it also is pointing towards the future. Within these parameters, so within the parameter of the morality, of the finite number of sources, and of the different forms of presence, what I would like to point out is how still a rethinking of what the time of the Prophet was and what it means for the present happened from the end of the 19th century. And for that, I will be looking at Halis Musaddas to the time of Bahadur Yar Jung, which is mainly the 1930s and 1940s in the princely state of Hyderabad. And we will see that within this very short time, the image of the time of the Prophet got profoundly reworked and rethought. If we start with the Aligarh perception, Aligarh, as everyone knows, was very closely linked to the colonial project. The stages of development, which were a central model for the concept of the civilizing mission by the British, was adopted to a large extent by the Aligarh movement. So the idea that all the societies progress through different stages through the same stages of development, starting with barbarity and then slowly being civilized, ending in the present, Britain being the most civilized country on earth and showing the path towards the future that all the other societies will sooner or later also proceed through. So a movement that every society has to have along a singular timeline directed towards the future, from barbarity to civilization. So the Aligarh historians did not, and Aligarh intellectuals did not have a problem with the stages of development as such. Still, there were a number of important reconfigurations. The first is that Hali, on the one hand, adopted the timeline directed towards the future, but reintroduced the image of the ebb and the flow. So within this line towards the future, the topic of recurrent stages of having reached a point in civilization, then declining, then rising up again, then possibly declining again, was introduced, which already is not the same thing as the unilateral drive towards the future. So it is not that once you have reached a stage of progress, there will never be the problem, never be the possibility of falling back. So within the linear progress, the topic of repetition and of circularity is introduced without the tension between the two being ever completely resolved. The second is the notion of progress, of taraqi, which engages with the British concept of progress insofar as the image of what progress looks like really seems to be taken from Victorian writings. At the same time, taraqi itself has a notable difference to progress. It involves a different take on temporalities, as it is almost endowed with a substance. So taraqi is not something which only reaches out towards the future, but taraqi can also have happened in the past. So the time of the Prophet is an age of taraqi, which afterwards gets lost. So it is really this looking at taraqi on the one hand, not as something which is directed towards an unknown future, but it is a future which is known. It is a future which has happened once already. And also the idea that taraqi is something that you can own, which is like a substance. You can have it and you can lose it. So the idea of taraqi par pahunchna, you can arrive at taraqi. You cannot arrive at progress in English. So progress is always open-ended. Taraqi has a definite goal, and this goal can be reached in the past already, and it can be reached again in the future, but it is not open-ended. The way that Hali devises the age of the Prophet, which for him extends until the end, at least, of the Abbasid Empire. So it is not only the Prophet, it is the whole expansion of the Islamic community, and it is especially the age of the Abbasid Empire, is based on knowledge and on civilization. So what is the most important characterization of the age of the Prophet and of the action of the Prophet is that he introduced an age of knowledge, that he introduced an age of inquiry, which also translated into civilization. So adab and tamadun are the two most important characteristics. By looking for ilm with all its emotional background. So it is not just knowledge, but it is knowledge endowed with an affectivity. The community gets civilized and acquires a state of civilization, which means a civilization of every single individual, but also a civilization of the community as a whole. This means they are passionate about learning. This means they are devoted to hard work, but they are also endowed with kindness, with compassion. They know the value and the worth of time. So all the what might be called Victorian values are there. The Victorian values for someone like Hali would be the same as are present in the age of the Prophet, but the temporality in which they are embedded works differently. What is important for Hali is that not only was the Islamic Empire civilized and knowledgeable, but they were endowed with knowledge to an extent that they could teach Europe that the whole progress of Europe from the Renaissance onward was built on acquiring the knowledge that Islam partly had kept and translated from the Greek, partly had newly developed. And what is important for him is that, unlike the Muslims who declined and did not keep the knowledge, the Europeans kept the knowledge alive that the Muslims gave them. So if now Muslims were learning from the colonial power, they were only taking back what they had given the Europeans at an earlier stage. So once their ebb came, the flow of the Europeans started. Now it was the time for a new Islamic flow and perhaps for an ebb of the Europeans. So what I really would like to underline is the way that the prophetic age, as the longed for past, the past that at the same time is present in the present, but is also an object of nostalgia, an object of desire for the future, is an age which is characterized in the first place by knowledge and by civilization. This is what is going to change profoundly in the 20th century. So we are coming to Bahadur Yar Jung now, who was a representative of the lower nobility and the princely state of Hyderabad in the Deccan, in the south of India, and who through his status as a noble had access to very different public spheres. So as a noble, he was part of a courtly culture. He had a direct access to the Nizam, to the ruler, but he was also very much a modern politician. So he was involved first in the Tablighi Jamaat, then became in the inner mission for the Muslims, trying to make Muslims better Muslims. So he toured Hyderabad for about 3 years, going from village to village and trying to reconvert Muslims and teaching them to be proper Muslims. After that, he was active for some time in the Ghaksar movement of Inayatullah Mashriqi, and then founded his own association cum party, the Majlis-e-Ittihad-e-Muslimin, which was partly an association, but then started to work as a political party and tried to regroup the Muslims as a political force in Hyderabad state. At the same time, Bahadur Yar Jung was known as one of the best orators of the first half of the 20th century, to the extent that Sarojini Naidu, the collaborator of Gandhi, who also was from Hyderabad, once, when listening to him, jumped onto the stage, embraced him and said, "You are my true son," which is something which I found quite unbelievable for a long time, because she was Congress, he was linked to the Muslim League, He was a radical Muslim. She subscribed to a reconciliation between Hindus and Muslims. So the whole ethics really were different, but his power as an orator must have been so extraordinary that the pure beauty of his language was strong enough to override any content related differences. So if now we look at the way that he is depicting the prophetic time, what first strikes is that knowledge does not play any role any longer. So he doesn't even mention that. What takes the place of knowledge are the soldierly virtues of the prophet and of his companion. So his image of the prophet is not that of a teacher who gently promotes knowledge and teaches people virtue, but of the soldier who spends his night on the back of unsettled horses and who gets blisters on his hands by digging trenches. So a very different way of depicting the prophet still as the prophet and the time of the prophet still as the object of longing, the object of desire. This formality does not change, but the content within this within this structure is radically different. It is not the teacher, it is not knowledge, it is the soldier, and it is masculinity seen as the ability to suffer, but also to fight. The direct conclusion he draws from that for Hyderabad in the 1930s is the need for unity among the Muslims, the need for cultivating the strength of the community, and the need for militarization and militarism. He speaks of askariyat of the Muslim community. And this is directly linked also with his position in the Raksan movement and also in the Ittihad, meaning the training of volunteers, the drilling in parades, the training in the use of arms, the training in military strategies as the way to revive the Islamic community. So no interest in knowledge, no interest in teaching, no interest in founding schools and colleges, but the interest goes through the drill to the drill of the bodies, the drill of masculinity, so reviving masculinist virtues and training the Muslims to be soldiers again. So this masculinity, if we compare that with the, let's say, traditional masculinity of the Hyderabadi nobility or also of the Mughal nobility, which was a masculinity based on balance. So Itdal was the key concept. And I always find that very beautifully depicted in the portraits, in the early portraits of the Nizam, where they are always shown with a sword in one hand and the rose in the other. So no denying of military virtues. It was a military aristocracy, of course, but the military has always to be balanced with the rose, with the ability of cultivating the heart, being able to enjoy poetry, to compose poetry oneself, and to have the dilgudas, to have the melting heart, which then allows for a certain form of interaction. If we look at the masculinity of Bahadur Yar Jung, it is no longer itidal, it is josh. It is the cultivation of passions. It is the passions and the unbridled passions, the not balanced passions, which make for masculinity. So the form of masculinity is no longer the balance. It is no longer the sword and the rose. It is just the sword. It is a preparation for the battle. It is a preparation for obedience, fearlessness, and hard work. And that is the qualities he also sees embodied in the prophet and his companions. So no rose there, but just the sword. To this corresponds that his golden age for that he desires ends immediately after the prophetic time. So the decline for him sets in with the Umayyads already. It includes the Mughals. So be it the Umayyads, be it the Abbasids, be it the Mughal Empire, for him were all sites of decline of the Muslims, very unlike Aligarh and Hali, of course, because these were aristocracies, and aristocracies for him went together with the worship of luxury. It was Aish-parasti, it was repose, it was aram. So all the characteristics which went against the cultivation of a military virtue. It was gatherings instead of razm, the war, and it was taking up musical instruments instead of weapons. So a very clear anti-aristocratic, anti-feudal positioning, which went together with the position against knowledge. At the same time, the perception of time for him was extremely important for the transformation of the Muslim community. So cultivating the virtues which were needed in the present went through the cultivation of ideas about the past, Mazika Khayal. So reflecting on the past gave the impulse for transforming the present, endowing the present with feelings, and thinking about the future. And the three temporalities for him are linked through these emotions. So it is no longer possible to clearly separate the present from the past, because without the past and without the presence of the past, there is no orientation in the present. And without the past, without the revival of the past, without taking the past into the present, there is no hope for the future. These emotions that he is creating by looking at the past, by taking the past into the present, or allowing the past an access in the present, are extremely important for the form of political mobilization that he is aiming at. If you just recall the 1930s, the Government of India Act of 1935, then the struggle for the federation, the negotiations, what would be the role of the princely states in an Indian federation, made the princely states important for the future of India to an extent they'd never been before. So it depended on who were the ones to call the shots in the princely states, whether the princely states would be used as a conservative force by the British to prevent further constitutional development, or whether it would be possible to capture the princely states either by the Congress or by the Muslim League in order to use them to bolster up their own positions. So what Bahadur Yar Jung at that moment does is using the emotions that he has created by looking at the Islamic past in order to create a certain policy for the present, in order to transform Hyderabad into a Muslim community, and at the same time delegitimizing both the ruler of Hyderabad and also the aristocracy, and trying to put a Muslim force in their place. As long as he was alive until the beginning of the 1940s, he was still able to keep a certain balance in this endeavor, because as a noble, he still had the access to the nobility, and he could play on the different fronts at the same time. After his death, the Ittihad radicalized. It became a radical Muslim party, which in the end took over the state and established a regime of terror, which was one of the reasons why it was so easy for the Indian state to annex the princely state of Hyderabad in 48 and to legitimize the demise of the princely state of Hyderabad. And I think I can leave it at that. And I'm waiting for your comments and questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that extremely edifying and very pedagogical. I hope lots of students are watching this, and I hope many of them do watch this later. So many interesting themes and so closely relevant to so much in the present, talking about the presence of the past. This past from the 1930s has been returning to us over the past 5 years with something of a vengeance all over the world, I think, which is very, very interesting in itself, not to mention quite terrifying. First of all, it reminds me of Marcus Dexel's Politics of Self-Expression, the Urdu middle class milieu from the 1930s to the 1950s, in which it's not Bahadur Yar Jung, but Allama Mashriqi, who founded the Khaksar movement, of which Bahadur Yar Jung became an important figure in Hyderabad. And Dexel is saying that it's a kind of a milieu of fascism, a background noise, as he says. He says this kind of background pervaded virtually the entire political sphere, whether it was the Congress party for which he takes Bosch, whether it's the Khaksar movement, or whether it's Savarkar. Those are the figures that he uses. So Bahadur Yar Jung actually fits very interestingly in that. No doubt this would be a very, very overdetermined phenomenon. So all kinds of things would have gone into this emergence, the emergence of this sensibility and this very, very dramatically different visualization of the past. So Dexel postulates that it has some kind of relation, the forms of imagination that emerged at this particular time had something to do, which is his analysis, with something to do with the emergence of consumer capitalism at this time in the early 20th century. He uses advertisements, for instance, a lot, which foster a certain kind of imagination. But of course, you're right to go back to Hali as well, because the historicization that you're talking about actually began there, and a kind of imperial vision of Muslim history also emerged precisely at that time, not just with Hali, but many of the other figures around Sayyid Ahmad Khan's Rufkai-Kar, as they're called. So one of the questions I had was precisely that. What do you think went into between Hali and this 1930s, this period, Bahadur Yar Jung's period? So what is the reason? What are the overdeterminations? Some of the overdeterminations of this of the emergence of this dramatically different sensibility. And the other one, the critique of progress, in some sense. You know, I was thinking of Priya Satya's new book, Time's Monster, which is precisely about this progress. Once again, the role that progress played. I think over here, you know, I'm sitting here in Karachi, Sayyid Ahmad Khan is a very, very important figure, and many of these people who subscribe to that entire civilizing mission and the civilizing narrative of history, yeah, is really quite alive in Pakistan, and it's central to progressive Pakistani culture. Yeah. So I was wondering what you would have to say to that. They feel lots of people feel at a loss for you know, progressive politics without precisely this genealogy and this way of looking at history. So what would you say to those people? So I'll start with those two questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the questions. I think that's really, really important. What changes between Hali and Bahadur Yar Jung is the way they look at the past. I think the rise of Josh as a category starts earlier. It starts with Syed Ahmed Khan already. And I find that a very interesting development, because the way we look at Syed Ahmed Khan is usually as the rationalist, as the very, very straight and unmoved figure who just follows his path and who has rationality and knowledge at the core of his endeavor. So I think looking at his texts and also reading the Musaddas carefully, Josh is already a very important category. So it is the assumption that it is only Josh which can save the community. So it is not the rationality and the knowledge is necessary, but it is also the Josh, especially of the young men, which gives them the quality of the heart and the strong feelings which are necessary for regeneration. So it is a combination of some Spencer on the one hand, of a form of Darwinism, of a form of wanting to do something against decline and degeneration, and feeling that this is only possible through strong emotions. So it is both at the same time. And I think that is really what struck me as so important in the last couple of years when I did my research on emotions and modernity, that we always, when we talked about modernity, when we talked about progress, we always talked about discipline. And that is so important. I mean, discipline in the colonial sense, but also self-discipline, etc. This is really something, and modernity as an interiorization of discipline, Foucault, and you mentioned that. I think that is really important. But at the same time, what gets lost through that approach is that at this very same time and with the very same people who propagate this disciplining, they also propagate Josh. They also want to have the strong emotions. And for them, it is not a contradiction. So bringing back the emotionalization as something which is as inherently linked to modernity as discipline is something that I've really struggled with the last couple of years. And it is there for the Aligarh movement. It's there for Syed Ahmed Khan himself. It is there for his close collaborators. It is there for Hali. So it is always this coming back to George, coming back to the anxiety. What happens to the young man? Their blood is turning white, and they are only sighing where they used to have hamdardi, where they used to have strong passions for the community, and where they used to interact, and where they had this Javan Madli. So that starts with the Aligarh movement already. It gets a different turn in the interwar period, and I'm not sure that I would agree with Marcus Dexel in linking that to fascism only. I think it is something which is really there across the board. You have it in the socialist movements in India, you have it in the Congress movement, you have this strong desire for strong passions, which is there all over the board. And this belief that any form of safeguarding the future of a community can only be by feeling strongly. And it's almost like a competition of which is the community which has the strongest feeling, because once the feelings are there, once the passions are strong, that is a guarantee for virility, but it's also a guarantee for survival. To link that with consumer capitalism is tempting, because it's a kind, I mean, either consumer capitalism or global capitalism is an explanation which works almost everywhere, but I'm not sure whether that is the only one. I'm also not sure whether I really have an alternative explanation, and the reason why that is worrying me is that I see this as a movement which is not continuing to the present, but which is returning in the present. So this drive for gut feelings, this drive for strong passions, this desire, I mean, what Lisa Mitchell calls this hailing the state and showing your heart. So not only to feel strongly, but to take out to the street and demonstrate how strong you feel about an issue is something that I think at the moment is a worldwide phenomenon. You can see it, of course, in South Asia, but you can also see it in Britain. You can see it in the US. You can see it in Brazil. Wherever you look, you have this. I mean, it's at the back of all forms of populism, of course, but it goes much beyond that, and it's also there in academia. So this whole talk about presence is, of course, also something that we want to go beyond the linguistic turn. We don't want to talk only about representations and concepts, but we want to have something which is more hot-blooded and which grips us directly in the guts. And we don't want to have just emotions. We want to have affects, because they're non-representational and they're more direct and they're more bodily. So I think it's not just a popular phenomenon. It's something that I see in our own community as academics also. How to link that to a critique of progress? I think it's, again, I'm very ambivalent about that. I see on the one hand that progressive politics is something that we absolutely need, not only in South Asia, but again, worldwide. We can't do without it. We can't do without secularism. But then on the other hand, what does that imply for our critique of colonialism? So do we need the concept of progress in the way that colonialism has introduced that? Do we go back to this timeline towards progress? Or is there another way that we can think about temporalities, that we can think about, well, perhaps even hauntology? So in how far are the ghosts of the past with us? And how far is the past an active force which influences the present? So it's not just us looking at the past and trying to write its history, but it's also the past coming into the present with an agency of its own, which are things that I find very helpful to think with at the moment. But at the same time, I'm aware that they might undermine a progressive politics, and that's really what's worrying me. So if you have some thoughts on that, I would really appreciate your help.
Thank you. Sajjad, if I may, before.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for that very, very engaging set of responses. For me, more and more, the way I think of the presence of the past is just by sheer materiality. I mean, matter implies continuity, even though, and that includes words and discourses, of course, which are all material. So they undergo transformation. All matter undergoes transformation. The forms of matter undergo transformation. But the past is necessarily, whether it is through language or all kinds of other forms, of course, of materiality, present. It is inevitably present. There's no getting rid of the past. So I'm kind of of the Faulkner school of thought. The past isn't dead, it isn't even past. But the question is, what form? Yeah. So as you can imagine, I have this question about nostalgia also. So as I see it, there are very, very different forms of nostalgia, which also imply, of course, different temporalities. So, for instance, you yourself had a beautifully nostalgic moment in your paper, for instance, when you recalled the balance between the rose and the sword. To speak, so recently I'm reading Thomas Bauer's book, Culture of Ambiguity, an alternative history of Islam, which has just become available in English. He's also talking about a lost past, virtually lost past. But the past that he's longing for, or is reminding us of, and a longing, a kind of Sehnsucht, is implied in that recovery, of this lost past. But like your description of the co-presence, the co-presence of the rose and the sword, this also, the culture of ambiguity, is a very different kind of nostalgia from the kind of nostalgia that you have in Bahadur Yar Jung and so many of these figures, in this time period. There were some figures, like somebody like Intizar Hussain, for instance, another form of nostalgia for the pre-partition India, which has come to be called, lots of people have this discourse, although other peoples are very critical of it, which is the Indo-Muslim past, or Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb, as they call it, so a pre-partition. It does have its obviously pastoral moments, so that's my response to what you said. Thank you for those really wonderful reflections.
I agree with you on the materiality, so that there is a presence of the past in the materiality. What I'm wondering is, how can we reconcile this materiality with concepts of fluidity? So that is something where I really also struggle with Koselleck. So his ideas of sedimentation, of Zeitschichten, of layers of time, for my I find them helpful, but then for my taste, they are too much set in stone, if you forgive the pun. So it is not something where the past flows into the present. There is no, I've really come to love this concept of the fluidity, where the past flows into the present, where it has a quality that you can't really seize. You can't dig it up and count the stones as you can with the temporal layers with Kozelek. So that is a project of archaeology, and you can classify things and you can put them in the museum. I think that what interests me in the way that the past comes into the present is the fluidity, and I'm really trying out to link that to ghosts. And one of the projects I'm doing at the moment is to look at the ghosts films of the Nehruvian era, which for a long time was really conceived as the era of progress, which was very clear cut. It is science, it is dams, it is march towards the future. And that is reflected in many of the films, but you also have the other films. You also have this ghost-like past which refuses to go away, which is not a full-fledged trauma, but it is something which is left over from the past, but perhaps also not left over, but it was past at one point and then it re-emerges into the present. So materiality is super important, but it is also the non-material and the more vague kind of influence that I would like to seize, and I don't really know how to do it at the moment. That's why I'm so interested in these conversations.
Thank you. Sajjad?
Yeah, I just want to take us back to, I guess, the earlier theme of, this whole issue of reason versus passion, or the development from a rationalistic Aligarh conception to a more martial one with in the 30s and 40s, and it seems to me that clearly they work side by side. So already in the 19th century, as you already indicated with Josh in Sayyid Ahmad Khan, it's clear that there were two kind of lessons to be drawn from the success of muscular imperial Protestantism. So one was precisely the rationalizing, civilizing mission of the university and the kind of the new archive and new episteme. And alongside there was the idea that, to be successful, you had to actually be capable of imposing your will and your force upon the other, right? So those kind of two conceptions are already there side by side. I guess the question is, why does the Josh, or why does the martial reading, for example, the prophetic past, become dominant in this particular conception in the 30s and maybe the 40s? Or is it because of the way in which we're slicing the archive and looking at it in that way? Because it's and alongside that, I wonder if it's something which is also about what's happening in Hyderabad. So one thinks about some of the productions of Osmania in terms of the editions and translations of texts. It's this period when Tabari is translated. It's this period in which the various classical Arabic histories of the conquests are also edited and produced. So I'm wondering if there is a more kind of local, perhaps, explanation of what's going on with this turn with Bahadur Yar Jung in particular.
Yeah, I think Josh can relate to reason in very different ways. So as I see it in the Aligarh movement, it is not so much imposing your will by force on someone else, but it is the quality of Josh itself. So it is what it does to an individual, and mostly to a man, to have strong passions. So these strong passions can be hamdardi. There can be a josh of hamdardi. There can be a josh for Islam, which need not be aggressive. So it is not imposing your will, but it is what that does to the substance of the individual, to the substance of the community, to prevent decline. So it is, once their blood is hot and boiling, then eo ipso they will become strong. It is not because they impose their will. It is not because they take arms. I mean, Aligarh has never talked about taking arms against the colonial power, but it is this cultivation of Javan Mardi, Josh, you name it, which gives this drive towards the future. It becomes different in the interwar period, and I think it has partly to do because so much is at stake. So the fight for the future, which was still a more abstract reflection, perhaps for Aligarh, or something which happened within a stable framework, now suddenly leads to a future which is wide open and which needs to be fought for. And it is an immediate reality that within the next generation, the British will be gone and the power struggle is very real. On the sociological side, I think it is the importance of the volunteer organizations, again, throughout the political spectrum. So the fact that, be it the socialists or the Congress or the Tanzim or the Tabligh or whosoever, that you have mainly young people organized as volunteers, dressed in military uniforms, learning to parade, learning to bear perhaps not arms, but at least lathis, which gives a different take already to Josh. Whether that is in any way specific to Hyderabad, I'm not sure. I see Hyderabad as very much integrated to the all India spectrum. I mean, both through the Aligarhis who are at Osmania and at the Nizam College and at the Anjuman Taraqi Urdu. I mean, this really is closely tied together, and very often it is that they come from North India, but the patronage is in Hyderabad, so that is why they moved to Hyderabad. So it's not Hyderabad specific. It is the constitutional struggle in Hyderabad, which of course means that there is very much at stake at the moment. So the late 30s are the time when there is a commission to determine a constitution and to decide about the distribution of power between the different groups in the states. So there is something which needs to be fought for immediately. So that gives a certain edge for that. But the same in a way is also true in North India. So the fights also go on in the north. So I'm not sure I would go for an Hyderabad specific explanation. I would argue with the future, which is more and more open and which needs communities to take their stand and to become a specific kind of person or a specific kind of community in order to survive for the future. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I mean, in that sense, it's kind of, it's sort of transforming a discourse of George towards really one of power, really. And power is something that is to be imposed. And it seems that yes, I mean, that's emerging in the 30s, I guess, precisely because of the way in which they can see the different nationalist movements are which are often trying to either kind of invoke soft power or try to invoke, sort of powerlessness through nonviolence, and seeing that maybe that just doesn't work. Nothing was really achieved from those sorts of movements. So there could be something in that. But I think, yeah, perhaps this issue of power, not least because, of course, you've got even wider kind of socioeconomic, changes going on. I mean, you've got, economic depression, you've got kind of issues around unemployability, you've got kind of like, poverty in the rural areas. I mean, there's lots of other kinds of things going on at the same time, which would make this desire to kind of cling to reconceptualize identity in the form of power even more attractive. And then to see the prophetic golden age in that way, I guess, kind of makes sense as well. But in a sense, that's precisely the kind of the issue. If we're saying this is sort of cyclical, which it sort of is, because these are precisely the issues even now. Violence, non-violence. The way of the pen versus the way of the AK-47 or whatever. These are still very much at times the rather simple options which are articulated even in the Muslim context in India now. Which seems to me a rather bizarre thing, but it still plays out even now in the way in which one conceives of the present, and one conceives of the legacies of pre-47, but also a much longer legacy of Muslims in South Asia, and also going back to the early prophetic period as well. So, I mean, maybe it's a bit too simplistic to say it's really about power, but it strikes me that that's the concept which is emerging and becoming quite significant.
I think it is important to keep it in mind. So I've always underlined that the history of emotions is not an alternative to the history of politics, and that power is an important and remains a very important category. But on the other hand, I'm a bit wary of interpretations to say there is poverty, there's deprivation, therefore there is this emotion and the other. So I think it works in a slightly more complicated way. So the knowledge about emotions and the way that emotions are cultivated are not directly translatable either into power or be explained by certain economic developments. The economic developments are important, but I think the relation is a bit more complicated than that. And also you're mentioning nonviolence. That is one of the projects I still would like to follow up to look in more detail on what Gandhi wrote about masculinity. I think it is not that different. I mean, claims like if I had to choose between how does he call it? Does he say virility? No, he said between fear and what? Just give me a moment. What are the two categories that he's bringing together? If he had to choose between emasculation and nonviolence, he would rather choose violence than renouncing the power of, he doesn't call it Josh, but it is there in a certain way. Yeah. So it is a certain form of masculinity that even Gandhi subscribes to. And it's a different way of cultivating it. It's more related to categories of discipline, but it is also, I think it's not so easy to have this clear-cut distinction between discipline and emotions as well, because there can also be this desire for discipline. And I think for Gandhi and some of his collaborators, it is this desire which really is very strong. So you have the disciplined individual, which becoming this kind of individual becomes the object of desire. and raises strong emotions. So I think it is really, there's so many ways in which discipline and emotions crisscross each other.
Yeah. No, Nauman, do you want to come in on that, or?
Yeah, really. I can't help but plug. I've just started reading it myself. Shanila Khoja Mulji's new book, which is called Sovereign Attachments, Masculinity, Muslimness, and Affective Politics in Pakistan, where she talks about Islamo-masculinity. Now, I haven't started reading. I mean, I've started reading the book, but I haven't made much headway. I just got it yesterday in the midst of grading. But what she's talking about is sovereignty, yeah, which becomes so important. And I think sovereignty and that emotion that you're talking about, by the way, initially I thought you were talking about Josh Malyawadi when you said Josh, but which speaking once again of this Dexel's book, in which he calls what he calls Rausch, which is the German word, of course, that this emotion of Rausch that is demanded, and he connects a lot to also poetry, the kind of poetry that came into emergence and which was so essential to politics and still is to the Muslim public sphere. Yeah, and I think we have a lot of this kind of sentiment. Josh, who's a progressive, but you also have it in Iqbal a lot, and I think he's essential to the constitution of modern masculinity. But of course, this kind of masculinization began, I mean, if I remember correctly, from what was it, Alter was his name, when he's talking about this formation of modern masculinity in the late 19th century with the emergence of all these akhadas, where precisely in this period of proto-nationalism. But sovereignty really comes into its own. I don't know if she says this, but my sense is that sovereignty really comes into its own, the discourse of sovereignty and sovereign attachments, as she's calling them, really come into their own precisely in this time period. Yeah. So I think that's another way of looking at it. Yeah.
And also because it is, I mean, I find it interesting that you mentioned the akhadas in this connection, because it is really a concept which is not class-based. So it is something which crosses the class division. And what I found so interesting is the role, for instance, of the akhadas in the Tanzim movement. So where you have a lower class, where you have groups of lower class young men trained in the akhadas in order to become part of the Tanzim movement under some leadership of the middle classes. But even the middle classes know that they cannot provide the form of bodily power that these young underclass, lower class men can provide. And that is what becomes so important during the riots, because they are then the ones who provide the protection to the houses of the middle class. And that really inverts it doesn't invert, but it complicates the relation between the classes.
Very interesting. Sorry, Sajjad, I interrupted you.
No, that's fine. I thought we'd take, there's some questions from Prashant in the chat. So the first one actually brings us back to this issue of the temporalities. So he's asking, aren't Bahadur Yar Jung and Hadi similar to each other in their shared assumption of a metaphysics of collective Muslim will across historical time and space? Also, what was Bahadur Yar Jung's conception of historical time if it wasn't, if I have understood you correctly, a cyclical return as in highly to prophetic time?
I think Bahadur Yar Jung isn't even, he is so little interested in knowledge that questions of whether this is cyclical or not doesn't really bother him. what is important for him is to model the present on the time of the prophet. So there is a certain cyclical assumption. No, perhaps not even a cyclical assumption. There is an assumption that the past of the prophet as a very specific time remains accessible. That is different from cyclical, I think. So there is one time in history which is, through the presence of the prophet, co-present with every other present. So it is not that you have a model of rise and decline of empires. So it is not a given kind of model of cyclical time, but it is one very specific time which remains accessible in the same way as the time of God would always run parallel to worldly time and be accessible in any moment. So I think that is something that I wouldn't be the person to develop that, because I don't know enough about theology, but perhaps you could do that, in how far thinking about God's eternity and about the prophet as a trans-temporal being would complicate the way that people like Bahadur Yar Jung or lots of others think about temporality. So it is not only the past, it is a different present, which is both past and present and future, because it links to eternity.
I mean, in a sense, that's precisely the fight, you could say, as Shirley Tharin has shown about the contemporary kind of theology of the prophet, that, the prophet is either a figure of the past, or the prophet always has been, always will be, right?
Yeah.
So at one level, that's precisely the same. But it also seems, I mean, it's another concept which came to mind when thinking about this kind of Bahadur Yar Jung. If he really does think there's this something which is exceptional, so to speak, about the prophetic time, and then there's this huge decline, and then there's this requirement to revive this. So it's as if there was an exceptional moment of sovereignty with the prophet, which needs to be reimagined and effected in the present, right? So, and that's something which is not cyclical at all, because it just assumes that past moment is not one of many moments which may have happened, but it's a unique, exceptional moment.
Because it is exceptional, it is still present.
Yeah, and that's why it needs to be made present again now.
Perhaps not only made present, but it is present because there is a different agency. So I think the figure of thought is both at the same time. There is an agency in the present. We have to model our present on the model of the prophet, but it is also the prophet himself who remains present, and there the agency goes to the prophet and not to the believer.
I mean, it would actually be interesting maybe to think about how, I mean, if he does, you said he's not necessarily the most profound thinker, but does he have much to say about the pre-prophetic past? No. So because that would be interesting. How does he conceive of previous religious dispensations and revelations and previous communities and so forth? Because if one is going to take a cyclical view, then one would see that as that prophetic, that kind of divine intervention in history happening cyclically, right? So the period of say the prophet is similar to a particular Mosaic period, which is similar to a particular sort of period of Jesus and so forth. And so like a whole series of divine interventions going back in time. And but that doesn't seem to be what his conception is at all.
Mm.
But that would, I mean, that would be interesting because, you know, also at the same time in the colonial period, you have people thinking about the past in a broader way. You have people thinking about, you know, where do we fit Indic sacred history into a wider sacred history? You know, where do we fit Krishna and where do we fit Buddha and all this sort of stuff? And are they manifestations of this kind of divine intervention history or not? There are a couple of other questions. Shall we take Prashant's other questions as well? The other one he has is, does Josh exclude aesthetic pleasure? I ask this because I recall Hali saying that his Musaddas was not composed for enjoyment. It would seem that for Hali and perhaps for Bahadur Yar Jung's rhetorical prowess later, aesthetic pleasure disrupts pragmatic uses of literary aesthetics for reform and progress. Is it because the notion of progress is closely associated with the notion of univalent communication, where the sign negates itself in favor of the unambiguous message? I almost feel like I need to ask Prashant to translate that.
And I think,
I mean, I think what you said was
it's
that
both. It's both at the same time. I think it is aesthetic pleasure is no longer legitimated. So it is no longer talking about the rose and being self-confident enough to have the rose and saying the rose is important. And it is the enjoyment of a poem which transforms the inner being and therefore has a role in the transformation of both the character and the community and the present. But at the same time, there is, of course, an aesthetic pleasure, even in this form of denying aesthetic pleasure. So the fact that Bahadur Yar Jung was such an impressive orator means that there is also, it is not just the indexicality of what he is saying, it is how he is saying that, which conveys the message, and which, if we can believe this anecdote of Sarojini Naidu, also conveys a form of pleasure, which is completely delinked from what he is saying. So the fact that there is Josh does not mean that the aesthetic categories are disappearing. They can be, they can lack legitimation, but they are still very much there. So it's no longer a discourse about aesthetics, but the aesthetic pleasure remains central. I think that's a very simple answer for a very complicated question. So I mean, I'm sure
I think that's the sort of issue about, you know, it's not, you know, even when people talk about the ghazal or the nazm in modernism having to move towards a more kind of functional usage of it, right? Where it is about the message, or especially if leftist, people talk about leftist sort of literature in that way. But clearly that literature was still enjoyed by people, right? Yeah. They still, you know, and so yeah, there is an interesting kind of paradox, you know, about someone saying this, it's all about the message, but it's the oratory which works. And this whole question, I mean, I find this issue of oratory interesting because, you know, when I think of some of the other figures that people talk about as being great orators in the 20th century, and then now and then I've kind of heard clips of them and I'm wondering what's the fascination, because I can't see it. Maybe you had to kind of be there. But, you know, people talk about like Ali Shariati being a great orator. People talk about Bhutto being a great orator. People talk about Khomeini, etc., etc. And so, yeah, I kind of wonder about, you know, what is that particular idiom? What is the grammar of what they're doing in that particular context, which makes it great oratory? And perhaps it's something which we cannot grasp because we were not in that moment. So it's maybe that when you read a transcript of Bahadur Yar Jung, or you read a transcript of someone else now, it seems rather flat.
Yeah.
But that's because you weren't there in the moment.
Yeah.
And that seems to me somewhat of a problem of how to analyze oratory, the difference between what is actually delivered as opposed to what is then kind of captured in some sort of inscribed form.
Actually, Sajjad, if I may say, I would think that has more to do with your sensibility, your particular sensibility. I think it continues to inspire a lot of people.
Yeah, that's probably. I mean, maybe I'm just cynical.
Yeah, I mean, and also you have you have a totally different system of affects, which is related to your very, very different ideas of history, of what it is you want from history. Really, I mean, one of the reasons that you have this, I mean, the modern period, after all, is a period of taking on these grand historical projects, becoming collective singular, as Kozelek puts it, collective singular historical subjects. Yeah, it's a period of historical voluntarism. You don't have that kind of voluntarism. Yeah. But that's what, from the late 19th century and right through this period, I think closely associated with those affects is these really bizarre, historically narcissistic, which are still with us, of course. Yeah, and it's so crucial to nationalism, actually, and continues to be. These grand, not just, I mean, and now with this, Mars, etc., they're not just historical, they're actually like cosmological kinds of ambitions and aspirations that people have. Yeah, so I think given for cynical, cynical is not the right word. I think just having your head straight, right, is what it's about. Yeah, I mean, we live in a time in which people have really crazy fantasies about world historical transformation, and not just world historical transformation. Human beings will eventually, I don't know, conquer the universe or something. Yeah. But
the whole idea is those fantasies go back to people like Hali and Iqbal and
totally
Sayyid Ahmed Khan and Shibli. I mean, we haven't mentioned Shibli, but it seems that Shibli is probably quite relevant to a lot of these kind of notions about how we look at history and issues around masculinity, issues around passion versus reason as well.
Right. I did also want to mention, sorry, Professor Pernua, I will return to you right away, but you've inspired all these thoughts. I was also thinking we should mention the fact that similar transformations are happening in all of the other religious traditions. So in the late 19th century, there is this, of course, muscular Christianity thing that's going on. Bizarre, as if, Jesus Christ was a bodybuilder or something. Yeah, you actually have, in the Trump movement, you actually have representations of Jesus as a bodybuilder on the cross. But it's also happening in the transformation of the conception of divinity in Hinduism, which many people have written about. Hindus and others, they talk about Ram, but even a female deity like Kali is transformed from the late 19th century as I can't recall exactly, Kaviraj. Sudipta Kaviraj has mentioned this, but in that volume, Hindus and Others, which Gyan Pandey brought out many years ago, there is a similar sort of trajectory in the militarization of Ram, who we now totally think of. I mean, if you actually look at the epic, he's a very delicate and almost effeminate figure. I mean, even in the dramatization that you have, Netflix has the Ramayana, which I watched the whole thing. There's like 30 episodes or something, but Ram is a really delicate and he's a non-violent kind of figure, but in the representations that you get over the over the course of the 20th century, especially, he becomes a totally militaristic figure.
Yeah, and I think that's also important. I mean, taking your two interventions together, which I find an indication that we really need to move beyond this logocentrism that we had in history writing for so long. So oratory, we need the sound element in that. We need to be attentive how sound and the attunement to certain forms of sound need to be historicized. So it is not just listening to a recording of Bahadur Yar Jung. I don't think one exists, but even if it existed, it does not directly give us the access to how this sound was experienced at that time. So to historicize that, to bring in more of the visuality. So how were figures of gods and goddesses transformed in that time? What other visual sources do we have? How do they interact with the written material? So I think it's something that we are really fighting with at the moment, how to have a history of temporality, or more generally an intellectual history, which goes beyond the word and takes the other senses serious in the way that they are as historic as the text that we are reading. None of us would imagine reading a 19th century text as if it was a newspaper article printed yesterday. So we know how to historicize that. And how can we do the same thing for visual images and for sound bites as well?
Prashant actually has one more question, which also gives us another look at temporality. So it's, doesn't the heterotemporality of novels like Aligarh Yar offer an alternative to 19th, 20th century models of progress as total and collective improvement? The solution would be, we aim for progress only in regions of the social, content with local improvements in social justice, never assuming the possibility of species-wide progress. Wouldn't this actually be an approximation of pre-capitalist Islamicate and Indic models of progress? I'm not sure I read Aligarh Yar in that way, but anyway. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this idea of heterotemporality, whether it is from literature or from other sources, is something that I'm really drawn to. So I don't think I can explore all the accesses to temporality in one talk, but to have these different approaches to see in how far literature has a different take on temporality than movies, than newspaper articles, than oratory, etc., I think is really something that is important. And to see how these different takes of, I mean, on the one hand, there are different takes on temporality which coexist. And on the other hand, there is an imagination of time as heterotemporality, where different times exist at the same time. So we have it at the level of the sources, and also at the analytical level.
Yeah, and I guess once you start opening it up on precisely in literature, then there's so many other kind of literary examples you could think of, you know, works which do precisely that, or look at a particular situation and transpose it. So, you know, everything from like Basti to Adagan to kind of even Moth Smoke, and you know, and many other examples would sort of fit into that notion. But I mean, I think for me the most important sort of take home on the work I think that you are doing on temporalities is precisely, as you said, what possibilities does that open up for us in the future? You know, how do we look at different notions of temporality within a South Asian context, whether it's in the pre-colonial or colonial period? and then think about what sort of decolonial pluriversal options you have in the future. And that's what is exciting about this. And certainly within, I think not just within notions of, the past, the present past, or the hauntology, if you will, of the prophetic past. But this, this is true of almost every religious tradition, the way in which the past is never truly past. In any kind of system of, Heilige Geschichte, that's always going to be the case, regardless. But I think it's also perhaps the way in which we think of human lives. I mean, we think of human lives as having some sort of development of a particular narrative, and that narrative has a kind of a pre-story, and it has kind of a post-story. So that's as a totality, that is who you are. That is your identity. Your identity is not necessarily who you are at this particular time or this particular day, but your identity is the totality of your being across the whole of that. And even the Quranic idea of this kind of pre-eternity of being an atom, and speaking, the speaking atom of what the poets call the Rose Alast. That's part of, that's not human history. That's human being. That's our being, which is across all notions of temporality. There is no temporality in that moment, even if you can use the term moment to describe it. So I think that's a totally different way of looking at the human anyway, where we're not confined to these kind of notions of, as you said, past, present, and future.
And then to think about a way that identity not only encompasses the entire temporality, but also in how far the different elements of temporality are co-present. So not to reintroduce this linear narrative to say, I once was a speaking atom, now, then I have become, and then I am, and one day I will be, but I'm everything at the same time.
But it also, because it also begs the question of different, so you can potentially have different models of a future. So there's something very different about, say, an Adorno, Tabas, and others, conception of a messianic future, say, right, with one which is perhaps a bit more fitting within a Christian or an Islamic or another conception of messianism, where the future is not just now, but the future will continue to be, and the future is not just something which is of this earth. So for me, that kind of the messianism of someone like Adorno is a bit disturbing, because it's so material. It's so kind of reductively material and of the now and of this world. Whereas that's, not how I, for example, see messianism. Messianism is one in which the distinction between this world and otherworldly planes of existence do not arise. But then that's another kind of, perhaps maybe metaphysical commitment I have through someone like Mullah Sadra, where you have planes of existence. You don't have the pre-world, this world, and an afterlife. It's just planes of existence, which in many ways coincide and coexist, and in which temporalities are constantly being, the distinction of temporalities are constantly being violated. Because time in itself is unreal. But anyway, that's
Can I add to that? So one of the things about a messianic future is its radical unknown character. The problem with what a lot of what we're talking about is in the narrative of progress is that the future is actually known. Yeah, because if you're going to make progress, you already have a model of whatever it is you think the future is going to be. Whereas the messianic future, just like they seem to know exactly what the past is, they impose the present both on the past and some, I mean, basically Britain in the period that we are talking about, some presence in the present you project onto the future. So in the future we will become like Britain, which is supposed to have achieved progress, or America, or whatever. So I think one of the main differences in this regard between a messianic is this radical unknown character, because the messianic, even the Messiah does not know when the Messiah will arrive. Yeah, that's how radically unknown. I mean, that's despite the fact that, of course, the Messiah, for all intents and purposes, knows certainly a lot more than we all know. But amongst the things that the Messiah does not know is when the Messiah will arrive. Yeah, that's how radically unknown the future is. Whereas this view of progress is quite the opposite.
Anyway, I think it was kind of inevitable that talking about temporalities, you're going to get to messianism, but anyways,
Yeah.
or maybe that's just us.
But in terms of what you were saying, in terms of the lessons for decolonial project, I mean, first of all, the kinds of affects that Professor Pernua talked about in this talk, and the kinds of relationships with history that Professor Pernua was talking about, those are very, very present in the present. Yeah. So one of the things this does is, of course, historicizes and allows us to detach, because a lot of people think that these are perfectly natural ways of relating to time, especially Padha Likha literate people. Yeah. Amongst Padha Likha people, these are almost inevitable ways of feeling. I mean, they constantly try to inspire you to feel these kinds of emotions, these sovereign attachments, as Hoja Mulji says, to the past, a past that in fact has been imposed on the Prophet. Yeah, right. Which is basically some fantasy of the present which has been imposed on the past. Yeah, so I think Professor Pernua's presentation, and this is for students especially, this is the work that historicization is supposed to do, is to help us detach from the present, in fact. Yeah, detach from these structures and forces and even feelings. Affects is exactly the kind of work that Professor Pernua does, in which we feel sort of locked or in the present. Yeah. Thank you so much. That was so marvelous. There's such a great presentation.
Thank you.
Discussion. Yeah.
Also, I mean, just linking with something that Margrit had mentioned, and in fact, from a talk that she gave, I think recently, I was actually reading the Kleinberg book earlier today, and it is a wonderfully interesting, study of how we look at history. So, the application of hauntology, and a certain critique of both how people look at the issue of presence within history, but also what is the function of history? What are we doing when we're doing history? Are we assuming a past that has to be recovered? Are we imposing upon that narrative of past something which is a fantasy of, and what exactly are we doing, and how are we in a sense working between our imagination and the traces of the past, which are very real. So yes, if anyone is interested, I would also recommend the Kleinberg book. It's definitely worth having a look at.
And also the book by Anand Taneja on the
Yes, yeah, we actually had Anand on a few weeks ago,
okay,
talking about Ghalib. So yes, absolutely, genealogy is definitely worth reading as well. So yes, thank you, Margrit, from me as well, and thank you to everyone who has tuned in today, and I hope you've enjoyed the conversation as much as we have. We have just one seminar left in the series, which is going to be in a couple of weeks, and it will be on music, or the musical tradition in Hindustan and its associations with the theme that we've been dealing with. And in a sense, we need a break. It's been a long year, for all of us, but it won't be the end, because hopefully next year we will continue with the series, but we will expand it beyond South Asia, but continue very much the theme of Islam after colonialism. So thank you once again from me, and hope to see you all at the next one.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.